Hello, this is Tony Speaks, and this is my lovely wife, Kim. We are the founders and co creators of the lifestyle brand and podcast, Becoming Disciplined. Every week we meet, learn from, and share best practices with highly disciplined men and women from a variety of fields and endeavors. Follow us on our journey. This week on Becoming Disciplined, we speak to Dr. Elia Powers. Dr. Powers teaches mass communication research, media literacy, media and politics, news editing, sports writing, and the multimedia reporting capstone course at Towson University. As a journalist for more than 15 years, he has covered higher education, health, business, sports, media, and the arts for publications such as the Los Angeles Times, Inside Higher Education, and MediaShift. His research interests are audience engagement and the impact of journalism, youth civic engagement, and news media literacy, and media and disabilities. His research has been published in peer-reviewed journals such as Journalism Studies, Digital Journalism, Newspaper Research Journal, Journal of Broadcasting and Electronic Media, and the Journal of Media Business Studies. He graduated with a Ph.D. in Journalism Studies in May 2014 from the University of Maryland's Philip Merrill College of Journalism, where he was named the top graduate student in the 2013-2014 school year. He earned a master's degree in American Cultural Studies from Washington University in St. Louis and a bachelor's degree in journalism from Northwestern University's Medill School of Journalism. And on top of that, Dr. Powers is a very gracious person to talk to. We were glad to have him on the podcast. Please check him out. So today on Becoming Disciplined, we interview Dr. Elia Powers. So Dr. Powers, we just want to welcome you to Becoming Disciplined. For our listeners, this is a different type of interview. We normally look at the context of an interviewee, and then we examine their strengths and weaknesses and look at the broader issue of discipline. But today we want to look at the particular subject of discipline as it relates to a particular field, and a field that is under much scrutiny nowadays. A field or an occupation that I tried for a little over a year, the field of journalism. Now, Dr. Powers, what type of discipline is necessary to thrive in the field of journalism?
Sure. And thanks, Tony, for having me on. It's good to see you. I love this first question. I've never actually had somebody ask me that in exactly this way, so it got me thinking about it. There's, I would say, a couple of things. One is just the discipline to become a subject matter expert. And so, one of the things about journalism that I tell my students is, you have to be a good communicator, a good writer, but also you have to just be curious and really get to know a subject. That's one of the great things about journalism, but also one of the sort of harder things is being disciplined if you're covering politics or local city council meetings, to just sort of become an expert enough so that you're fluent in understanding what people are talking about. So that's one area of discipline. Another has to do more with just being disciplined as far as, if you're on a daily or these days hourly deadline, just being disciplined enough to just put stuff out and hit deadlines and just be able to be okay with giving it your best and not being a perfectionist, because in this field a lot of it's just sort of doing your best, writing the first draft of history, as we like to say, and then sort of moving on and to fight your next battle. So there's a lot of discipline in just being able to organize your thoughts and communicate those out to the public. It's hard to do on a daily basis. But those are two things that stand out to me. I mean, there's more that we could talk about, but those stand out.
Now, it was startling to me the difference between writing for the web and writing for a printed tactile version. It was startling to me, to the difference. Was that startling to you way back when you first started, or was that just me being Tony?
You actually have probably a better. So I do freelancing now, and I do a podcast, but I have not. I have not been a full-time journalist on the web as you were, in the last couple of years. So when I was reporting, most of my work was still on sort of a daily deadline, kind of more of a print schedule. Toward the end of my sort of full-time career, we were starting to move toward, trying to get stuff out immediately when it happened. And yeah, I mean, like the main difference that I noticed is just one, you can be a little more informal online. You can deliver the information in different ways. It doesn't have to all be in a long narrative story. People love live blogs and sort of shorter thoughts and videos and just different ways to communicate. So yeah, it's kind of a whole new language and it's exciting. But it also, again, back to my previous comment, just it's it adds more on the journalist's plate. They have more things they have to think about now rather than just putting together one story at the end of a day and then calling it a day. It's kind of constant, constant barrage. So it's good and bad at the same time.
Awesome, awesome. Now, just so people can understand your context, Dr. Powers, did you always dream of being a journalist?
I mean, yeah, it depends how you define always. I mean, going back to like, when I was a kid, I had my, I ran a family newspaper, where I would like interview people in my family. So, pretty early. I mean, I was pretty infatuated with the idea of, people telling people stories from a pretty young age. And yeah, I editor of the high school paper, did journalism in college. I was pretty focused on that. I never like really strongly considered another profession.
Okay. Now, who was a early hero of yours in the journalistic field?
Oh, that's a good question. I was definitely really into Sports Illustrated, and so they had Gary Smith was a writer that I really liked. I really liked like columnists and magazine writers, people who like and mostly I was really into sports early on, like a lot of people, are, and so yeah, just anyone who was writing about sports, telling really interesting stories. Those were people that I really, and then later on, I obviously started paying more attention to politics, and so a lot of the people that were writing for like the Post and were Washington Post were certainly people that I looked up to.
That's cool. It's amazing you said that. My big hero, my big people I listened to as a kid was, um, I used to read as a kid was Michael Wilbon and Tony
Hmm.
Kornheiser when they used
Yep.
to go back and forth,
Hmm.
and it was kind of like a call and response that they used to have back in the day because Wilbon was such a Michael Jordan fan and Kornheiser
Yeah.
was a little bit of a critic.
Yeah, and
Uh,
people don't realize. I mean, they got their start at the right. I mean, now people just know them as ESPN talking heads, but they put in. Speaking of discipline, actually, they put in years and years and years. As print reporters covering college basketball, NFL. So I always tell students, I teach sports writing. One of the things I tell them is like, it may seem like the easiest way into the field, and the best way is just put up a YouTube channel and like start to opine. But like they put in their years, they put in their they like paid their dues in newspaper journalism before they became famous rich
right, right.
TV talking heads, and so that's another discipline I guess that you could talk about.
Now I remember that the greatest moment that I had was a story that I actually withheld, but because I withheld the story, um, it's hard to explain, but it led to a public policy correction. But my presence there led to a public policy correction, and if I hadn't been there, something negative would have occurred. Can you share your proudest moment as a journalist where your presence made a difference?
And it wasn't, this wasn't a breaking news story. One individual who had been incarcerated and who then went on to sort of help other people who had been in his shoes to sort of find work. One of the hard things is finding a full steady work after you've been in that situation. And so that's one of those cases where I felt like I was shining a spotlight on something that mattered and people cared about, and it was just I like the fact that I could make people more aware of this issue. So that was something that was meaningful. Another example, a different job, I was covering actually like, higher education before I went into teaching. And I did a story about how in the classroom, very much based on personal experiences that I have had, a lot of times I had felt, I wasn't always comfortable speaking up in class, and I felt like sometimes people who are teaching classes, were penalizing students who, for whatever reason, were either more shy or were afraid of public speaking. And so, again, raising awareness of an issue like that, I just like. I like, one of my favorite types of stories are types that bring up an issue that people probably like kind of think about, but it's not maybe on the top of their mind. And so, but in both of those cases, I can't say like policy change wasn't that direct, but I can certainly say that there was judging by readership and comments and other things that people started thinking and talking more about some of these issues in public policy or in education that I thought were I'm glad I put on the agenda at least.
Now, what made you move from journalism to teaching?
Yeah, that's a good question. Partly what I was saying before, I was never, just knowing myself, I was never a huge fan of just the pace of journalism, just how quickly I had to turn around stories. I was not the fastest writer. I wasn't great online. The just velocity at which you had to sort of churn out content. I started to just want a little bit of a break from that, and I really had enjoyed. I enjoy writing, and now I'm podcasting, but I kind of enjoy doing that more now that I can kind of set my own schedule and freelance when I'm interested in something I can cover it, not be on sort of that daily grind. And I really enjoyed. I taught during a summer at a program, and I just really enjoyed editing and working with young students on improving the writing and the creativity in that. And yeah, so that's initially what brought me to that, and then eventually, got a little bit more into like research and some of the stuff you do as a college professor. But yeah, I just enjoyed mentorship. I've always enjoyed, like even when I was in college or high school, my friends would occasionally say, "Hey, can you look at this essay for me? You're good at grammar, right? Can you, so that kind of got me interested in it. And yeah, I like, working with young, with students, and in the days where we can be in person, over a year ago, just like the interaction of being on a college campus. It's a nice way to spend your time.
Awesome, awesome. Now, what I'm learning with studying this specific topic of discipline is that one of the keys to discipline is actually developing habits, and then once you have a habit, then the habit it doesn't even feel like discipline. It's just something that you do. Do you or can you recommend 2 or 3 habits for journalists that they can develop that will make them better journalists on a day-to-day basis?
Yeah, that's a great question. I would say again, kind of following the same structure as I was saying before. I mean, number one would definitely just be read like first thing when you get up, depending on what you're asked to do that day. Read a bunch of people that you like, not necessarily just from one outlet, but if you can, across different perspectives, different you know national, international. Just read up on something that you're interested in. I mean, really, a lot of I think being asking good questions, especially, is just being well informed. And so, if you go into interviews really well informed on the topic, as much as you can, being well informed on the person you're talking to. I mean, you can be great at asking questions, but if you haven't done your homework on who the person is and what they've done, and then it's going to be obvious to the other person that you're not quite, like you didn't take advantage of everything you could. So that's one half. Just prepare, be interested, read a lot, or listen to stuff. Just like do like if I, like if I'm doing a podcast interview, I make sure that I've paid attention to anything the person's written, anything the person has done on a similar show. Like I did an interview last week with a book author, and I had to just go back and listen to interviews to see, okay, how did he answer this question? Can I even refer to that? And can I like ask him a follow up question? So that's definitely something. And then as far as like producing it, I mean, a lot of it is just about um, being clear about outlining what you want to say and trying to keep in mind that your goal is to not only be creative, make the person care about whatever you're writing about, but also do it in a way that is, these days especially straightforward and enough that you're going to keep the reader's attention. We have so much out there now that it's really important to, and this is something I have to work on a lot, is to, keep it short, or if you're going to make someone stay with you for a certain amount of time, make sure there is a strong like narrative hook or really strong kind of, interest that you're drawing at, out of the person. So just keep in mind that people don't have a lot of time, and you need to really like make them want to care about whoever you're writing about. That's sort of the two things I would mention.
Awesome, awesome. Now, one of the areas I struggled with, because of course sometimes people they get real. It's weird if you're recording them with a pen and a paper, they're calm and comfortable.
Right.
But if you're recording them with an electronic device, they get edgy. So a lot of times I would have to record with a pencil and paper just to make them comfortable. And my question is, do you have any tips regarding really good note taking?
Mm. It's actually interesting. One of the great things, I mean, mostly I would say, COVID and being away from people is bad as far as like, because you don't develop rapport. But I will say the one thing that is easier about it is like we're all so used to now just being on Zoom and being on video conferencing and just recording and just, I mean, I'm not paying any attention right now to the fact that you're recording this, right? Whereas if
Right.
you're in person, holding, you have to sort of hold that, or, it's just more of an awkward exchange. So I guess I mean, so I guess all that is to say that I think actually being on Zoom is actually a way to get around that. But as far as in person, yeah, I mean, I was always taught that, like, especially if you're interviewing an athlete or city council, the mayor, that person is probably going to be pretty used to like press conferences and being recorded. But if it's just someone you're going up to on the street, or somebody who has never talked to the press before and you're in person, yeah, I mean, usually I tell my students, try to just talk for a little bit, have some, sort of just throw out some kind of questions that or you're not going to use, but you just want to ask them about stuff just to start the conversation. And then once you're kind of ready, like once they've said the first thing that like you want to really use, then you just say, oh, actually, do you mind if I just pull out my my notebook and just start taking notes? I want to just make sure that I accurately quote you. I don't want to get anything wrong. And I'm going to take notes and record what you're saying just so I can play it back later. So if you try to do it as naturally as possible, I feel like it's less. Yeah, but if you walk up like with a recorder and your notepad, it's gonna, yeah, you might put them off in the same way that if you were trying to like pick someone up at a bar, you wouldn't want to like immediately buy them a drink. You want to sort of just start talking to them, and then once you're in conversation, whatever.
Right,
If
right,
that
right.
analogy works, but that's you want to sort of play it cool at first, and then almost have them not notice that you're taking notes.
Mm.
So,
Okay.
yeah,
Okay. Now, and I'm gonna give my context to kind of help understand, so that people listening can
sure.
understand where I'm coming from. One of the things that I did, I looking back, I feel like I failed at as a reporter for that 1 year, is I didn't always manage relationships well. And what I mean by that is, I was, in order to be a good local reporter, you have to have a relationship with, as an example, law enforcement. And sometimes I felt like I was in my effort to get comfortable with law enforcement and get the tips and get the scoops. I felt like I was almost becoming a propaganda tool for law enforcement, and I kind of felt like I was going down that path, and I didn't know, and it was hard for me to manage. Okay, if I write a critical story, then I lose this relationship, and I need the relationship for scoops. So I had, and now in my defense, I've been paying attention in the Richmond area lately, and I'm not the only reporter who blurs this line. So I've noticed other people who are way more seasoned than I
Yeah.
blur this line, and I felt like I didn't manage, in particular, my relationship with law enforcement well. How and emotional discipline is a discipline. Emotional intelligence is a discipline. So, as someone with a great deal of experience, uh, can you give us any advice for young reporters listening? How do you get close without getting too close, and how do you set up good boundaries with those type of relationships?
Yeah, that's a question that tells me for sure that you were really invested in what you were doing, because that's like, I think people, I think, who've never done journalism, I don't think really fully understand that, especially if you're covering a beat or a city, like, or an area like you were, that a lot of it has to do with, like, if you're a sports writer or a politics writer, a lot of the conversations you have are either off the record, which means that you don't use it, or on background, which means that like, you can use it but you can't attribute it. Like, there's all these different ways that you can sort of get information but not use it, because as a reporter, as you've learned, I'm sure, you want to be approachable and you want people to feel like they can talk to you without sort of feeling like you got to burn that. So yeah, I mean, it's just basically a matter of, I think, figuring out, how to make it clear to the person that you're covering that, I mean, this is a professional relationship, but that like, I want to be someone that you could talk to. So feel free, just establish, really, I mean, to me, it's sort of establish what, before you have any conversation, like, what are the ground rules here? Are you going to tell me stuff and I'm not going to use it? Are you going to tell me stuff and I can't use it on the record? If you're telling me something and it's so damning or so important for people to know about, that I'm willing to sort of say, well, like what you just said, I really need to use your name because, or, I need to report something, because if I don't, I'm just not going to be serving the people in my audience. That's sort of what it's about. Is just establishing trust and establishing the ground rules, so there's no misunderstandings. But yeah, it's hard. I mean, I think like all the time, especially if you're, I mean, again, go back to sports. If you're covering a team, I mean, you see probably 80% of what you see and hear, you never write about, probably because if you lose access, that's a huge problem. If a coach isn't going to talk to you, like you see this all the time with like Kevin Durant and other players. Once you've lost the person you're covering, it's hard to do your job, and so that's one of the things that you have to balance. And I can't say. I mean, I generally cover sort of general assignment stuff, so I didn't have a lot of experience on one beat where I was so like I needed one person so much that I could not burn bridges no matter what. But that can be a big issue when you're covering a smaller community where you have to come back to police the same people over and over again. So yeah, that's a great question that you brought up. And it's a hard one.
Right, right. Yeah, what I did was I would tell them, "Hey, listen, we're cool, but one day I'm going to write something that's going to make you very angry, and I'm just
Yeah.
asking for you to remember all the positive stories." But
Yeah.
I
Sure.
was just
Sure.
concerned about that first negative story, and I never
Mhm.
got to it.
Mhm.
Uh,
Mhm.
as a journalist, you're privy to information that the general public might not be focused on or aware of. So how have you resisted the inclination to judge your audience for their blissful ignorance? Because I kind of I was guilty a little bit of that, where you just kind of get frustrated, like, "Hey, are y'all listening? Are y'all paying attention? Do you see this happening?" And I had to kind of remind myself that it was my full time job to focus on the information, and these folks have other jobs. So but at the time, I did get a little judgy sometimes. So have you ever struggled with that?
Yeah, sometimes, and I think you're right. I mean, like, I think when you're covering it every day, and you're just someone who's like a junkie, you forget that most people, they check in on news every once in a while, but they don't necessarily know who everyone is, and yeah, you get so immersed in it that it's difficult. I never actually, so I don't know if I had that exact feeling that you did, where I felt like people like why aren't you paying attention? But I will say, I did sometimes, I mean, when I was able to sort of get some idea of like what stories I would write, would get the most attention, would get the most comment, whatever metrics I had about like how many engagements, is this having. And I would say I would get frustrated sometimes. Like the most popular story I ever covered when I was writing about like colleges was a story about how a school was getting rid of their dining trays because it was like they were afraid if people were piling in food in the dining room, like just hoarding stuff and not you. And so, that was like a throwaway story. It was like I spent 2 hours on it. It was like a whatever, not a meaningful story. And but it like blew up. It like got onto like I don't know, like when someone picks up your story, that's like a national outlet, and it goes. So and that was one of those cases where I was like, huh, okay. So like people sometimes just they don't want serious stories all the time. They sometimes just want quick fun stories that they can they can share. And so those kind of times are waking up calls a little bit that like okay, like I'm not just serving one purpose, which is just to like inform and hold powerful to hold the account powerful and do this kind of what we talk about as our mission. But some of what we do is just like come up write things that are fun stories that people want because they want to they want to like just have just share things that are like kind of quirky stories. And so but yeah, sometimes I did feel like all right, I wish my more serious stories, one that I spent more time on, would get a bigger audience because that's the stuff that I think is most meaningful. But sometimes your audience disagrees with you or
I
wants the
hear you.
quick stuff.
Yeah, I was surprised by the stuff that would go semi-viral and the
Yeah.
stuff that people would. It was amazing to me.
Hmm.
Now, how do you, as a seasoned journalist, how do you sift through bad information, or I guess the new term is fake news?
Hmm.
Any tips for our audience on discerning when a story is bullcrap?
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, yeah, that's a huge question. I mean, obviously on social media, I mean, this may seem kind of antiquated now, but I mean, checking into the source, cross-checking, first of all, seeing who it's by. I mean, there's, like the blue check mark on Twitter. There's things that social media sites do that are kind of surface level. I mean, but you can see. I mean, if somebody is not providing their source, if you don't know who the person is, if you look into them and they don't, actually have any authority on a topic. But I always tell my students just cross reference. It doesn't take that much time to Google to double check to see who else is covering something. Are they naming the sources? Kind of just figure out, are they an authority on it? Do they have any motivation to send you in the wrong direction? And can you cross verify that multiple sources are reporting something? And do that before you're retweeting it, before you're amplifying it, so that you check to see if it's true or at least unverified. And just resist, seeing stuff that agrees with whatever your kind of worldview is, and just sharing it because it feels good to own the other side or to sort of make a point, but just make sure that you're not part of the problem. Do your research first about who the person is, what their motivations might be.
Now we're living in a time where a lot of news media where they have opinion kind of mixed in with the facts. So you have like Rachel Maddow, and then you have the MSNBC News Hour. You have Fox. You have just about everything,
Mm.
and then the straight news. On CNN, you have Don Lemon and Chris Cuomo, and then you have the straight news. My question is, do you think a media company nowadays could survive economically if it just focused on the facts?
Yeah. So that's a really good question. I mean, I think certainly in like cable, what we've seen over the last couple of years is that opinion and driving, and a consistency of message and playing to your base was, especially with Fox News and to a certain extent MSNBC, that certainly has been a good business model. And so I think cable, it is harder on cable. I mean, C-SPAN and to some extent CNN, really do I think try over that model, and it's mixed results. I mean, I think places that have clear affiliations, clear views, in some cases, public relations, being totally affiliated with, the one party or the other. That does play well on cable. I mean, I can't sit here and say that just objective news and without opinion is the way to go, because I mean, ratings tell another story. When it comes to to sort of print and online and radio, I think there is still a market for fairly straight. I mean, some people, I disagree with people who say like NPR or the Washington Post has a huge liberal bent. I don't see that, but again, I mean that's just my feeling. I
Sure.
think they're fairly straight. But so I think there is a market for straight reporting without sort of a clear affiliation or a strong heavy opinion. But for commercial news outlets, opinion plays well. I mean, there's no doubt about it. So I think there's room for both. And if you're looking to, if your main business model is basically getting your content on social media, like if you're a place where really you just want to distribute it, people share things on social media that are more opinion based. That's sort of just like it's not, that's just a fact at this point. And so, if that's your model, right, then being more opinionated makes a big difference. But if your model is to get a small audience of people, who want to read good quality content online, and you want to get subscribers, I think you can have. There are enough publications out there that do pretty much straight reporting that prove that that's still a model that works. So really, both work, and it depends on the medium and sort of who your audience is.
Do you think there's a future market for media organizations being not for profit?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so yeah, for profits, a lot of especially newspapers have lost a lot of revenue. They lost a lot of, they just had to cut papers. Some of them are going out of business. Um, and yeah, so I do think nonprofit is a model. I don't think like, what we've learned is that not enough nonprofits. I mean, so the nonprofits that are here, they usually employ a handful of journalists at the most. Sometimes it's just like one or two people. And so they're not making up for the losses that the sort of, so if a newspaper leaves a city and a nonprofit comes in, it's likely that the newspaper had 40 people and the nonprofit might have 7 or 8. And so it's certainly better than nothing. And I do think nonprofit is a model that works well, and allows you to cover something in depth. Like there are publications that are just focused on the criminal justice system, or focused on politics, or focused on, I mean, there's very specific audiences. And so for those niche audiences, it works well, but it can be hard to get a big audience, sort of broad general public within your nonprofit, because it's just there's not enough revenue oftentimes to hire enough people to cover that. So I think it's one of the answers, but I don't think that the answer is for like everyone to be nonprofit, because I think that doesn't allow maybe for enough reach.
Sure. Now, for a young person who they're not ready to declare a major, and they're just curious about or even someone who's been in another field and they're exploring becoming a freelance reporter, do you have any book recommendations that you'd like to share with us?
Oh, interesting. Yeah. Well, there's an old, there's a really, just as far as like any writing tips, I always assign my students. There's a book called On Writing Well, which is like a pretty like classic book about just like sentence structure, how to be inquisitive, like that kind of stuff. I mean, I would certainly recommend. reading. Oh God, I'm forgetting the names. Any book about like a journalist, like reporters, not necessarily like Watergate style, but just like journalism these days, sort of what it's like. So either autobiographies or any sort of any sort of just books about modern day journalism. I don't know if there's not like one or two books that I would recommend necessarily, but just anything about what the field is like and what it's like from first person account from people who are in the industry. Yeah, those I'd certainly recommend.
Awesome, awesome. Now, Dr. Powers, you have a new podcast. Can you tell us about it and what inspired it?
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. So it's called Areas of Agreement, and the podcast is it's right now. I have 4 episodes out. I'm hoping to get maybe about double that. It's a limited series, so just kind of I think one long season. Basically, it's looking at the urban rural divide in the U.S., which is one of the major divides. In addition to sort of liberal conservative and so one of the things that I'm looking at, I'm taking part in a program that basically brings together people across these divides. I'm on a team that focuses on media issues. And so, as I was going through this program from Urban Rural Action, which is the group that's sort of organizing this, I thought this would be a really interesting, experience to document for people, right? To sort of see what it's like going through this as I'm sort of learning about it, as I'm talking with people on my team who are across the country who have different perspectives. And there's groups looking at things like race and education, food insecurity, things that impact all people. So basically, every episode looks at a different issue. The most recent episode focused on education and equity funding in Pennsylvania, about how schools in poorer communities get a lot less funding than in more wealthy communities. Another episode looked at how do you have constructive conversations across difference. So how do you talk to each other? If you just want to have dialogue with your uncle who doesn't agree with you, how do you do that? And I'll be looking at local news deserts, places again like where you live that are without really a lot of daily journalism. So that's basically what it's about. It's more of a narrative. It's not it's different than sort of a Q&A podcast. It's more so I do a bunch of interviews and I'm the host, and I basically kind of walk you through and tell the story with sound bites from different people. So yeah, it's been really an interesting experience. I've learned a lot about doing journalism, and also the urban rural divide through this.
Okay. Now, on what platforms is that posted?
So you can find it pretty much everywhere that you get podcasts. So Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Anchor. Those are the kind of the main ones where you can find it. Spotify and Apple Podcasts are probably the big two.
Okay. Now, and I'm going to post it at the end of the podcast, but you never know if someone might not make it there. So, can you give us the name one more time?
Sure. Areas of Agreement.
Areas of agreement.
So areas, so the yeah areas of agreement. Just look. I mean, the double entendre. They're like geographic areas, and then what are the areas that we can actually agree on? What are the topics? I'm focusing on topics that I think people across different perspectives can actually focus on and agree on, and kind of do a project about, rather than things that nobody can ever agree on. Because there are some topics, believe it or not, that people who have widely different perspectives can still agree on. It still exists. I promise you.
Absolutely, absolutely. Yeah. For our audience, I'll share this. The two podcasts that I saw of or that I heard of yours was just amazing. I strongly encourage our audience to check you out. Uh,
Thank you.
Dr. Powers, do you have any closing thoughts regarding the subject of discipline or the subject of journalism? What would you like to share with us as we close out? And as you close out, you're going to have the last word. I just want to thank you for coming on, and I thank you for sharing your
Yeah, thank you.
testimony and your wisdom with us.
Yeah, no, and I appreciate being on. It's great to talk to you. Yeah, I mean, I guess for people have never done journalism, I guess just I think one thing to just know is that a lot of people who go into journalism generally don't go into journalism for the money. They go to it because it's a passion and a calling, and they really they do want to make a difference. They don't. I've never talked to somebody who goes in with like a certain mind to persuade someone to change opinions or parties. It really is mostly just people wanting to better inform people. And so yeah, and that job takes a lot of discipline. It takes again a lot of time. It's at times it can be a thankless job. And so yeah, I mean, I just would love for people who are listening that and watching that are not have never done journalism to just keep in mind that that this is such a really important field, and a field that has had struggles, had financial struggles, and something that to the extent that you can support journalists in your community, not to turn this into a PSA, but I do think like understand that journalism is super important and it takes discipline and it takes time to do it, and it's worth saving because you get a better informed population and people that are just more engaged, connected when you have good journalism.
Well, thank you again, Dr. Powers, and we really
Thank you.
appreciate you. All right.
For sure.
I am a man of faith. In the religious texts that I read, and also in most major religions, unity and understanding are principles that are praised. We are living in divided times, though. If you want to listen to a podcast that heals some of our social and political wounds, Dr. Powers' podcast, Areas of Agreement, is the podcast to listen to. Dr. Stephen Covey once said, "Before you can be understood, you must seek to understand." Regardless of your background, in the American experiment, if you listen to Areas of Agreement, you will understand your neighbor in a more profound fashion. Please, for the sake of the nation, check it out.